have faced demons. I have stood at the breach of fortress walls while the sky above burned violet with the overflow of the immaterium, and I have not faltered. I have watched chaos-touched warriors tear open their own bodies in the name of ruinous powers I do not deign to name, and I have driven my blade through their hearts without hesitation, without pause, without the trembling consideration of mortality that haunts lesser men. I have knelt in the ash of 10,000 battlefields, my armor lacquered black with the dried blood of enemies too numerous to catalogue, and I have risen again every time, because the Emperor wills it, because the crusade demands it, because that is what we are. But I tell you this honestly, with no theater and no artifice. Nothing I had ever encountered prepared me for what emerged from the warp at the edge of the Kareth system on the 903rd day of the Third Templar Crusade of the Vain Blade, the crusade that carries, by some cruel tradition of my chapter's record keepers, my own name. It did not translate from the immaterium as a ship translates. Ships arrive with purpose. Ships carry intent behind them, however wicked that intent may be. What passed through the warp boundary that morning, if morning means anything in the trackless black between stars, was not a ship. It was a wound, a fissure in the logic of space, a slow, impossible intrusion of mass that should not exist, assembled by no architecture any human civilization ever designed, dragged from whatever lightless graveyard of the void it had haunted for centuries, perhaps millennia, and deposited in the gravity shadow of a dying red star as if placed there deliberately by some indifferent and ancient cruelty. The Space Hulk. Even now, speaking its name, the word feels insufficient. The human tongue was not built to describe something so comprehensively, so architecturally wrong. Our Auspex returns came back first as sensor ghosts. Anomalies the servitor crews aboard the strike cruiser Blade of the Unbroken Vow dismissed as interference from the magnetar activity in the outer system. Then came the mass readings. Then the second mass readings, which overrode the first because the first could not be accurate, because nothing with a mass signature that vast should be present in this system, unrecorded, uninvited, and still. Then came the visual confirmation. And with it a silence fell across every deck of every ship in our crusade fleet that I had never heard before and have never heard since. It was enormous in the way that geological formations are enormous, not with the engineered enormity of an Apocalypse-class battleship, not with the designed intimidation of an orbital fortress. It was enormous the way a mountain range is enormous, indifferent to your perception of it, pre-existing your gaze by an order of time so vast your existence is a rounding error. At its widest point, our augurs measured it at 31 kilometers. At its greatest length, 68. Its mass was the accumulated wreckage of no fewer than 12 distinct starship classes, compacted and fused by the impossible pressures of deep warp transit over what our tech adepts estimated, with trembling, reluctant certainty, to be no less than 4,000 standard years. For 1,000 years. There were vessels in that mass I recognized by silhouette, even at distance, even distorted by collision damage and the slow corrosion of millennia. An Emperor-class battleship, or what remained of one, its prow jutting from the larger accumulation like a buried tooth. The wreckage of what might once have been an Eldar cruiser, the particular sweeping geometry of its hull plates, even shattered, carrying that unmistakable Xeno's grace. Older shapes still, hulls whose designs predate the current classification systems, whose provenance traces back to eras my chapter's historians speak of only in whispered reference to the Age of Strife. And wound through all of it, through every duct and every corridor, along every sealed bulkhead and every open breach that vacuum should have rendered lifeless, were the biological signatures. Life, warmth, movement, so much of it. Brother Sergeant Aldrich Torm, a veteran of 40 years of continuous service at my side, stood at the Auspex station on the command bridge of the Vow and read back the bioform count to me in the flat, controlled voice of a man who has learned to suppress the sound of fear. He got as far as the third magnitude of estimate. Still climbing, still resolving, the servitors recalibrating their instruments because the first count had been rejected as impossible by the machine spirits governing our sensor banks before he stopped. I did not ask him why he stopped. I looked at the numbers on the display screen. I understood. Marshal Vorden Kale, commander of the Third Templar Crusade of the Vain Blade, stood at the head of the command table with both hands flat against its surface and his eyes fixed on the visual feed of the Hulk filling the main screen. He was a large man, even by the standards of our brotherhood. He had served the chapter for 112 years. His face was a map of its own history, scarred, purposeful, carrying in every line the evidence of decisions made under conditions of complete certainty and incomplete information, which is the condition in which all decisions in this galaxy must ultimately be made. He was silent for a very long time. When Marshal Kale finally spoke, his voice contained no doubt whatsoever. That was either the quality of command, or faith, or the particular insanity that the eternal crusade instills in those who prosecute it long enough. Perhaps all three. He said 6 words, and those 6 words set in motion everything I am about to tell you. He said, "We board it. We cleanse it." And I, who had faced demons, who had stood in the overflow of the immaterium without faltering, who had never once in 107 years of service questioned a command given in the Emperor's name. I stood there in the cold blue light of the bridge, staring at the bioform counts still climbing on the Auspex screen, and felt something move through me that took me 3 days to name properly. That something was dread. Let me tell you what we are so you understand what was asked of us. We are the Black Templars. We are not the Ultramarines, with their codified precision and their institutional certainty, their clean battlefields and their rehearsed doctrine. We are not the Blood Angels, haunted by inherited memory, wrestling with the dark inheritance of a flawed progenitor. We are not the Salamanders, measured in their mercy and generous in their consideration of those they protect. We are none of these things, and I say that not as diminishment but as definition. We are crusaders. We are the continuation of a holy war that Sigismund himself declared at the close of the heresy, a war without designated conclusion, without a single final enemy, without a cartographically fixed battlefield. Our enemy is the totality of everything that opposes the dominion of the Emperor, and that enemy is, by any honest accounting, infinite. We have been fighting this war for 10,000 years. We are still fighting it. We will fight it until the last Black Templar draws the last breath his catalepsian node permits him, and in his final moment, he will be trying to bring his blade down on whatever face of the enemy presents itself. This is not metaphor. This is not institutional pride dressed in martial language. This is simply the truth of what we are. My name is Malchin Vane. I have held the rank of Sword Brother for 31 years, and the rank of Line Captain for 19. I am 309 years old by the reckoning of the Terran Standard Calendar, though I have experienced fewer years than that due to warp transit. The mathematics of deep void travel age a man in irregular ways that even our apothecaries track with only approximate confidence. I have fought on 47 distinct crusades. I have personally killed, in the sense of the killing blow of the finishing stroke, no fewer than 812 sentient enemies of the Imperium, of which a measurable number were not human, and of that number 11 were possessed by warp entities. I tell you this not as boast. If you knew our brotherhood, you would understand that these numbers, while respectable, are not extraordinary. Brother Aldrich Torm at my side had been on crusade for 40 more years than I, and his kill count was triple mine. I have known sword brethren who have been fighting since the 36th millennium. I have broken bread with warriors for whom the scouring of Fenris is not historical record but living memory. We are old, and we are made of war, and we do not stop. I say all of this because when I describe what happened to us on the Hulk, the weight of it, the particular species of despair that settled into our brotherhood over the days that followed, I need you to understand how extraordinary that weight was. Men made of lesser material do not persevere in such places long enough to develop a philosophy about them. We were not lesser material. We had persevered through things that lesser material could not conceptualize. And what the Hulk did to us, to our certainty, to the architecture of our faith, it matters more, not less, because of what we were when we entered it. On the first day, while Marshal Kale's order was still reverberating through the fleet, and while the tech adepts aboard the Blade of the Unbroken Vow began the urgent work of analyzing the Hulk's external structure for viable breach points, I convened my command squad in the lower chapel. The lower chapel of the Vow was a small space by any standard except our own. Its walls were hung with the captured standards of 40 enemies, heretics, Xenos, the occasional renegade Space Marine chapter, the material testimony of campaigns concluded in the Emperor's name over decades of the ship service. Its altar held a fragment of bone claimed to be from the hand of Sigismund himself. Whether that claim was verifiable or simply one of those articles of faith that a crusading brotherhood maintains because the maintenance of such faith is itself a tactical necessity, I had never tried to determine. Some truths are more useful as mysteries. I looked at the faces of my squad. Aldrich Torm, as always, was already reading the disposition reports being transmitted from the Auspex suite. He had the constitution of something between a warrior and a machine. The emotional range of his face, even after decades of brotherhood, was so narrow that I had learned to read it the way one reads a fine instrument, in fractions, in the tiny deflections of the needle. His jaw had tightened marginally since the bridge. That marginal tightening, I had learned, was Aldrich's equivalent of anyone else going pale with dread. Brother Castor Ven, my standard-bearer, was in prayer. He was the youngest of my command group, a relatively brief 80 years of service behind him, and he prayed with the unambiguous certainty of someone who had not yet been tested sufficiently to produce doubt. I did not find this naive. I found it precious in the way that all things are precious which you suspect will not survive the approaching experience. Reclusiarch Brennick stood near the altar in his death mask, the ceramite skull face of his office watching us all with the blank authority of a being who has appointed himself the intermediary between his brothers and the absolute will of the Emperor. Brennick was 260 years old. He had seen things. His sermons were not the optimistic proclamations of a chaplain attempting to maintain morale. They were the cold, measured invocations of a man who had stood at the edge of the abyss and looked back not with hope but with the grim, granite satisfaction of still being present to report. He said nothing when I entered. He simply watched me from behind the skull mask, and I felt, as I always felt in his presence, that he was measuring something, the content of my faith, perhaps, the quality of my resolve. Whether what remained in me after 3 centuries of crusade was the genuine article, or merely the exhausted institutional reflex of a warrior who had been fighting too long to remember why. I knelt before the altar. I closed my eyes. I asked the Emperor, in whatever form the Emperor receives the supplication of such instruments as us, for guidance, for clarity, for the ability to do what was necessary without hesitation. I rose. I would discover, in the days to come, that he had answered. He had answered yes. On the 3rd day of preparation, we made contact with the Hulk. Not boarding contact, not yet. Communication contact, in the loosest possible sense of that term. The Mechanicum adepts aboard our accompanying vessel, the Iron Adherent, had spent 60 hours constructing a targeted deep Auspex array capable of mapping the internal structure of the Hulk in sufficient resolution to plan ingress. What they produced, in the end, was a cartography of Nightmare, a schematic that bore the same relationship to a functional ship's internal layout as a mass grave bears to an ordered cemetery. The Hulk had no internal logic. That is the essential thing to understand about such formations, and understanding it conceptually is utterly insufficient preparation for experiencing it in fact. I had read the Mechanicum texts on Space Hulk topology. I had studied historical accounts of boarding actions conducted against such formations, the disastrous campaign of the Crimson Fists, the partially successful purges conducted by various Deathwatch kill teams over the preceding centuries, the catastrophic losses sustained by the Salamander's 4th Company in the Hulk-designated Eternal Undertow 3 centuries ago. I knew, intellectually, that the interior would be a non-Euclidean maze of intersecting ship designs across multiple eras, with no consistent atmospheric pressure, no reliable gravitational orientation, no functioning infrastructure of any kind, and corridors that had been deformed, crushed, reopened, and blocked by the geological processes of repeated warp transit. None of that prepared me for the schematic itself, which our cartographers spread across the command table in 12 overlapping layers of topological data, each layer representing a depth stratum of the formation, and which collectively resembled nothing so much as the interior structure of a diseased and very ancient brain. We identified 9 viable breach points. Of these 9, 3 were immediately disqualified by the structural analysis. The surrounding hull material had been compromised to such a degree that any boarding torpedo impact would trigger further collapse, potentially sealing the entry point behind an advancing squad. 2 more were eliminated because the corridors immediately behind them, according to the Deep Auspex imaging, were so comprehensively blocked by fused debris as to constitute dead ends. Of the 4 remaining, Marshal Kale selected 3 for simultaneous assault. The 4th would be held in reserve as a potential extraction point, a decision that, I record here with something between gratitude and wonder, would eventually preserve a fraction of what survived. The boarding parties were assembled on day 4. I commanded the 2nd party, designated Sigma Assault Claw. My complement was 32 initiates, 6 Sword Brethren veterans of my command squad, including Aldrich Torm, 2 neophytes assigned as Vox operators and general utility personnel, and a single dreadnought, Brother Hearn, ancient beyond the counting of any living record in our chapter. His organic remains so thoroughly consumed by the injuries of ancient campaigns that only a relic of preserved flesh and a consciousness reduced to pure martial instinct remained within the dreadnought chassis. Hearn had been awake for 9 months at this point, which was unusual. Dreadnoughts are typically returned to slumber between engagements, the burden of sustained consciousness too great for the diminished biological substrate within the sarcophagus. Hearn had refused slumber for 9 months with a stubborn belligerence that our tech marines had chosen not to challenge, citing precedent that forcing a dreadnought into unwanted stasis was both technically inadvisable and, according to the relevant passage in the Rites of the Iron Cradle, spiritually irregular. He had spent those 9 months standing in the embarkation bay of the Vow in total silence, his sensor arrays facing the void-facing bulkhead as if he could see through the ship's hull to whatever lay beyond. I went to speak to him the night before the boarding. He did not turn when I approached. The grinding of old servos marked every slight adjustment of his chassis as I stood beside him. I addressed him formally, as the protocols require, as a battle brother, a superior in spirit if not in current assignment rank. I told him what we faced. I described the Hulk, its mass, its complexity, the bioform readings. He was silent for a long time after I finished. When he spoke, his voice came through the Vox emitter with the texture of deep gravel over rust, the peculiar tonality of a mind speaking through architecture rather than flesh. He said, "I know what is in that structure, Malchin Vane. I have felt its kind before. Not felt, endured. What waits in there is not simply hostile. It is patient in a way that stone is patient. It does not hate. It hungers. And that is more dangerous than hate." I asked him how old the infestation was, based on what he could sense. He said, "Older than my waking." Brother Hearn had been entombed for at least 4 centuries. I left him and returned to my quarters. I spent the remaining hours before embarkation performing the rites of the Eternal Crusade. The oil, the prayer, the slow act of armoring oneself that we are taught to treat not as mechanical preparation but as liturgical devotion. Each piece of power armor is placed with intention. Each seal is pressed with acknowledgement of what it represents. You are not dressing. You are becoming, piece by piece, what the Emperor requires. By the time the Vow's embarkation bay received the deployment order from Marshal Kale, I was armored, I was prayed, and I was as prepared as it is possible for a man to be for something he cannot be prepared for. The boarding torpedo is not a dignified mode of transit. It is a projectile. It accelerates its contents toward a fixed point with the single-minded arithmetic of ballistic physics, and it arrives at that fixed point with the subtlety of a geological event. The impact is felt in the skeleton before it is heard. The magnetic grapples engage with a sound like the end of something. The breaching drill activates. There is a period, lasting perhaps 30 seconds, during which you are in the torpedo's hold with your brothers in absolute darkness and absolute noise. And there is nothing to do in those 30 seconds except hold your weapon and believe. Then the drill breaches. Then the door blows open. Then you enter. The first thing I noticed was the cold. I had expected cold void temperature, the residual freeze of deep space bleeding through hull metal that had not known the warmth of a functioning reactor in centuries, perhaps millennia. What I had not expected was the character of that cold. It was not the clean, absolute cold of vacuum. It was the cold of a space that had once been warm and had been allowed to cool, the cold of abandonment, of a space that had known life and no longer did. The difference is subtle, and I am not certain I can describe it adequately through language alone. If you have ever entered a room in which someone has recently died, before the body has been removed but after the machines have been silenced, you will have some frame of reference. The corridor we breached into was 4 meters wide and perhaps 3 meters high at its highest point. The measurement varied because the ceiling above us had buckled in several places, driven down by the weight of whatever structure sat above it. The steel deformed in long, frozen waves like a still photograph of a material in the process of collapse. Our helmet lamps played across the corrugated metal surface and found no comfort there. The walls were original to the ship we had breached, an old Imperial vessel, the Vow's data suggested, possibly a carrier class from early in the 36th millennium, though the hull serial markings had been obliterated by fire damage that the Mechanicum adepts conservatively estimated was 3,000 years old. 3,000 years. I said that to myself silently as my squad spread out into tactical formation, Aldrich taking point, the Sword Brethren fanning into flanking positions, the neophytes pulling the emergency seal across the torpedo breach behind us to prevent atmospheric leak. 3,000 years. The Void has a way of eliminating abstract temporal concepts through the blunt force of direct experience, and standing in that corridor, in that cold, breathing recycled air that my suit's atmospheric sensors were cataloging as minimally viable, just sufficient oxygen, trace contaminants, particulate matter that might once have been various organic and inorganic substances, the 3,000 years became not a number but a presence. This ship had carried people. It had carried them from somewhere to somewhere, in the service of the Emperor or in the service of their own survival or in the service of some mundane commercial or administrative purpose. And those people had walked these corridors, and they had been warm, and they had been alive, and they were now so comprehensively gone that no molecular trace of them remained except the faint general contamination in the air that my suit was filtering as noise. I moved through the corridor toward our first objective marker, a junction point approximately 300 meters along, designated on our schematic as Node 7, which our cartographers had identified as a probable intersection with the vessel's original command spine. The plan was to push along the command spine toward the center of the Hulk, establishing a forward position from which the other assault claws could converge, effectively cutting the formation into manageable sectors that could then be systematically purged. The plan was tactically sound. The plan was constructed by experienced warriors with access to the best intelligence our fleet could gather. I mention this because it is important that you understand we were not reckless. We were not careless. We were not underprepared by the standards that could reasonably be applied to such an operation. The plan, like all plans made without complete knowledge, held within it the seeds of catastrophe. We moved. The first 300 meters passed in a silence I cannot adequately characterize except to call it thick. I have been in many silences, the silence of a battlefield between engagements, the silence of a ship in emergency venting, the silence of spaces where noise has been absorbed by destruction and not yet replaced by life. This silence was different because it was not simply an absence of sound. It was a presence, a quality of the space itself, as if the corridors had learned, over their millennia of dormancy, to generate quiet the way a living thing generates warmth. My Auspex was active. I checked it regularly. It registered the life signs of my squad members, the elevated respiration rates of the neophytes, the precisely regulated readings of the Sword Brethren, the anomalous signature of Brother Hearn that our Auspex systems have never quite learned to interpret correctly because his biology is no longer standard in any meaningful sense. Beyond my squad, the Auspex returned the steady, growing picture of the bioform distribution within the Hulk, thousands of readings, each one a living entity, their distribution mapped across the deep interior with a density that increased, our instruments suggested, toward the center of the formation. They were in there. They were aware of the topography of the structure in ways that our cartographers' maps could not replicate. They had been in there, in that darkness, for however long this formation had drifted breeding, adapting, filling every available space with the slow biological patience of a species whose only purposes are consumption and propagation. What I did not understand yet, what I would come to understand later at severe cost, was that they also perceived our presence. Not through the same mechanisms by which we perceive, not through sight or sound, not primarily. Through something else. A distributed neural sensitivity that the Mechanicum adepts had once described to me as pseudosynapse projection, though they had admitted that the term was a placeholder for something they did not fully understand. Whatever its mechanism, the effect was that the moment we entered the Hulk we were known. Not just detected. Known. I reached Node 7 and held up a fist to halt the column. Aldrich was already examining the junction point. 2 corridors crossing the one we had traversed, both extending into darkness in both directions, both registering on the Auspex as clear of immediate bioforms. I studied the walls at the junction. Someone had scratched words into the metal. Not carved, scratched, with something improvised, with some instrument of desperation, by hands that had been shaking. The High Gothic was archaic and partially illegible, but I could make out the salient portion. They are in the walls. They are in the walls. They are in the inscription ended there. Aldrich looked at me. I looked at the inscription. Then I looked at the walls. I ordered the advance to continue. It was Brother Castor Ven who first saw them. Not the Auspex. The Auspex saw them a fraction of a second later, a brief, almost reluctant registration of biological mass, as if the instruments themselves were hesitant to confirm what Castor had already experienced. He saw them first because he was watching the shadows at the far end of the corridor with the kind of attention that is not analytical but is rather the particular hyper-awareness of a warrior who has been afraid for long enough that his fear has transformed into something useful, a raw, undiscriminating sensitivity to wrongness. The shadows moved. That is the insufficient way to describe it. Shadows do not move in corridors without light sources capable of projecting them, and our helmet lamps had illuminated the far end of the passageway thoroughly enough to eliminate that kind of ambiguity. What Castor saw, what he reported over the Vox in a voice that was controlled but carried at its precise edge a quality I had never heard from him before, was not shadow in motion. It was the momentary absence of light where light had been, at the specific location of the ceiling junction 40 meters ahead. Not the floor. The ceiling. I processed that detail in the half-second between Castor's report and my first visual confirmation, and in that half-second the full weight of our tactical disadvantage assembled itself in my understanding with a terrible clarity. The Auspex scans of the Hulk's interior had returned bioform readings calibrated to a radial distribution model, a model that assumed the creatures moved primarily along floor-level corridors, as any biped or quadruped would. It had not adequately waited for the possibility that the primary transit medium of the organisms we were facing was not the corridors themselves but the ceiling, the walls, the ventilation conduits, the gap spaces between decks, every surface, in other words, that our tactical geometry had categorized as background rather than battlefield. We had been mapping the wrong terrain. The Genestealer came out of the ceiling without warning, without sound, with a velocity that defied anything my instincts suggested was achievable from a stationary position. It was on Brother Castor before the first burst of bolter fire had discharged, and the only thing that prevented his immediate death was the specific angle of his body in that instant. His banner-bearing arm extended, and the creature's opening swipe shattered the standard shaft and deflected the killing blow into a tearing graze across the pauldron rather than through the neck joint. He screamed, not in death, in rage. Castor Ven's scream was not the sound of a man losing himself to pain. It was the sound of a man recognizing an enemy. He drove his bolt pistol into the creature's torso at contact range and fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The first 2 detonated within the carapace. The third passed through the exit wound and punched a fist-sized hole in the corridor floor. The creature fell away from him, not dead but damaged. And in the 2 seconds it took to fall we had our first proper look at it in the hard light of our helmet lamps. Let me describe a Genestealer for you, not as the classification texts describe it, not with the cold mechanicum vocabulary of morphological type and clade designation, but as it appears when it is in motion in a confined space, oriented specifically toward your death. It is wrong in the way that deeply wrong things are wrong. Not in any single specific feature, but in the totality of its construction, in the sense that its body has been assembled by a logic entirely foreign to the evolutionary pressures that shaped anything native to this galaxy. For limbs below, 2 rending appendages above, a bilateral body plan that echoes humanoid form closely enough to be grotesque rather than comfortingly alien. The carapace is not the rigid shell of an insect. It is organic, flexible at the joints, capable of absorbing and distributing the force of impact in ways that make bladed weapons functionally unpredictable in their effectiveness. The eyes, this is the detail that endures in the memory, that surfaces unbidden in the quieter hours after. The eyes carry a luminescence that is not bioluminescence in any straightforward sense. It is something older and more deliberate, a quality of awareness, of intelligence, that no organism shaped purely by the pressures of predation should possess. They are not unintelligent. They are connected. Every Genestealer in that structure was, in that moment of first contact, informed by every other. Not through verbal communication, not through acoustic signal, not through any mechanism reducible to familiar physical process, through the brood bond, the distributed neural ecology that ties every member of an infestation to every other and, at the center of it all, to the patriarch that governs the entire biological network. When I shot that first creature, every creature in the Hulk felt it. And they responded. They came from the ceiling. They came from the wall conduits. They came from junction points we had passed and assessed as empty, their biological signatures suppressed, not absent but somehow deliberately quieted, held below the threshold of reliable auspex detection in a way that suggested either an instinctive understanding of our sensor technology or an active, coordinated tactical decision. The latter, I realized with a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature, was the more accurate interpretation. The corridor became a killing ground. My squad was at close order, which was the correct configuration for the corridor dimensions and which allowed us to bring the maximum volume of bolt fire to bear in the forward direction. The problem with close order in a Genestealer engagement is that the forward direction is rarely the only direction. Bolt rounds detonated against carapace and corridor wall with the rhythmic thunder of a sustained firefight. A sound I know well, that I have lived within for centuries, that under normal circumstances is almost meditative in its familiarity. In the closed acoustics of the Hulk's corridors, that same sound was amplified into something that bypassed the auditory processing of the Adeptus Astartes and engaged something older. Instinct. Not fear. We are not constituted for fear in the simple sense. But instinct, the body's older intelligence. The part that perceives the shape of survival independent of the rational mind's slower assessments. Brother Hearn, who had been moving at the rear of the column, spoke for the first time since we had entered the Hulk. He said, over the squad vox, in that granite and rust voice, "Close the formation. Whatever you do, do not allow them to separate us." Hearn had fought these things before. I did not ask when. I obeyed. For the next 6 hours we fought. Not in the way that I have fought across the open plains of siege worlds, where the geometry of the battlefield is visible and the relationship between effort and progress is at least theoretically legible. Not in the way I have fought in Void War, where the environment itself is the enemy and every variable can be reduced, eventually, to physics. This was different. This was corridor war at its most fundamental and most brutal, a kind of fighting that strips away every advantage of training and technology and planning and reduces the contest to the most primitive possible terms. Who can move faster in a confined space, who can sustain more damage, who breaks first. Genestealers do not break. I want to be precise about this because I think it is the single most important thing to understand about fighting them in an environment such as the Hulk, and I think it is the thing that most accounts of such engagements, the sanitized, tactically processed accounts compiled by inquisitorial scribes and chapter historians who were not present, systematically fail to communicate. Genestealers do not break. Not in the psychological sense, not in the tactical sense. They do not reassess their position when casualties reach a level that would cause any rational military force to reconsider its approach. They do not demonstrate the wavering of resolve, the brief hesitation, the collective pause and aggression that every other enemy I have ever faced will show, at some point, if you kill enough of them fast enough. They simply continue. If anything, the death of individuals in the brood appeared to stimulate the survivors to greater velocity, greater aggression, as if the loss of biomass from the collective generated a biological imperative to restore that loss through further consumption, and the nearest available biomass was us. The wave pattern of their attacks was not constant. They would press hard, then pull back, then press again from different directions with a coordination that could not have been improvised by individual organisms and that must therefore reflect the existence of a distributed command intelligence operating at a level we could not directly observe. We held. I will not diminish that. We held. The Sword Brethren are not shock troops in the simple sense. They are warriors shaped by decades of continuous crusade into something that functions at or near peak combat efficiency regardless of the specifics of its opposition. Aldrich Torm, operating at my left shoulder with a storm bolter that he had carried through 20 years of continuous service, cleared the ceiling junctions above us with a methodical efficiency that was almost geometrical, not reaction, not instinct alone, but the application of deep-coded tactical pattern to an immediate environment. He had mapped the angles. He had calculated the arcs. He had prepositioned his weapons tracking toward the points of likely emergence before the creatures were visible because he had been watching the auspex with one eye while engaging with the other, and had identified the behavioral pattern in the attack waves early enough to turn it into predictive targeting. 47 years of service. Every year had been deposited into the bank of his body and mind, and now it was being drawn against. We held. But the cost was real. Brother Sevas, who had been my right-hand sword brother for 11 years, was lost at the 4-hour mark. He was not killed in the sense of a single defined moment of death. He was overwhelmed when a simultaneous emergence of 3 creatures from a floor-level conduit disrupted our close formation for approximately 12 seconds. 12 seconds was insufficient time for any reasonable rescue action, and sufficient time, in a Genestealer engagement, for 3 creatures to do work that is irreversible. His armor had been breached at the left knee joint in the earlier fighting. The creatures found that breach. He died fighting, and he died without a sound, which was the Black Templar manner of dying, and I do not believe he would have wanted it any other way. I do not believe that, but I tell myself it because the alternative, the recognition that there was no noble quality whatsoever to the specific way Seves was taken from the world, is not useful. After 6 hours we had advanced 200 meters from Node 7. 200 meters in 6 hours. Our ammunition stocks had been depleted to levels that required strategic reassessment. The quantity of bolt rounds expended in that distance represented a logistical reality I had not fully weighted in the pre-boarding planning, and I will not pretend otherwise. We had believed the primary resistance would be overcome in the first phases of the advance, allowing us to push to the interior with reduced fire contact. We had believed that because every prior engagement with similar organisms at smaller infestation scales had shown that initial contact was the peak intensity event, after which a degraded but rational response would follow. It had not followed. I called a halt at a junction that Aldrich and Brother Hearn together identified as structurally superior for a defensive position. Not ideal but defensible, with 3 of the 4 possible approach corridors narrowing sufficiently to allow effective channeling of fire and the 4th blocked by debris at 20 meters distance. We set melta charges at the debris point and established a fire sector there just in case. I opened the inter-squad Vox channel. The other assault claws reported in. What I heard, in the controlled voices of my brothers doing their professional utmost to strip the news of the emotional texture it carried, was not encouraging. Sigma Assault Claw Alpha, Marshal Kale's personal claw, the spearhead, had suffered 4 dead in the first 2 hours and had been driven back from their primary objective by a concentrated brute assault of a scale that their pre-breach Auspex readings had not suggested was possible. They were holding a secondary position and requesting ammunition resupply via torpedo pod. Sigma Assault Claw Gamma, the 3rd insertion team, had lost contact with 2 of their squads entirely. Vox dead. Auspex life signs irregular. Their commander, Sword Brother Hale, was requesting authorization to redirect his remaining forces toward Alpha's position for a consolidated push. Hale granted the request. I listened to these reports in the brief quiet of our defensive position, with the distant sound of movement in the corridors beyond. Always movement, always the dry chitinous scrape of things that never stopped, that did not tire, that were waiting for the moment our vigilance fractured by even the smallest margin, and I began quietly to recalculate. Not our tactical position. Something deeper than that. On the second day inside the Hulk, Reclusiarch Brennick preached. He had done so every 6 hours since we entered, brief exhortations delivered over the squad Vox in the clipped, resonant cadences of a man who has had 260 years to perfect the architecture of spiritual address. Brennick's sermons were not comforting in any conventional sense. They were not designed to reduce fear through the provision of reassurance. They were designed to transform fear, to take the raw, biological response of a body under sustained threat and redirect it through the channel of faith into something that could be functionally deployed as will. He was, in that specific sense, extraordinarily skilled. I had listened to 112 of Brennick's field sermons over the years. I had found them, almost without exception, effective. On the second day, standing in the defensive position with my remaining sword brethren and the 7 initiates who had survived the first engagement sequence, I listened to Brennick's voice through the squad Vox and felt, for the first time in 107 years of service, that the words were not reaching me. Not because the words were inadequate. They were not inadequate. He watches through the darkness. He sees what you do here. Your blood spent in his name is already in his account. This is the formulation. I have known this formulation. I have believed this formulation with the comprehensive belief of a man who has constructed his entire identity upon its foundation. But I was looking at the space where Brother Seves had been. I was looking at the 14 empty positions in my formation, 14 brothers reduced from the complement of 40 that had entered this structure 30 hours ago. I was calculating, with the part of my mind that operates below the register of faith, the rate of attrition versus the progress made, and the mathematics of that calculation were producing an answer that faith could not simply revoke through the superior authority of spiritual declaration. At current attrition rate, with current progress rate, the central objective, the bio-node that our Mechanicum adepts had identified as the probable locus of the Patriarch's presence, toward which all our advance was theoretically directed, was not reachable by any combination of our remaining forces before our ammunition stocks reached critical insufficiency. I did not say this aloud. I did not transmit it on any Vox channel. I held it in my understanding and let it sit there and turned it over very carefully, examining it from multiple angles, looking for the error in the calculation that would allow me to reach a different conclusion. I did not find that error. Aldrich Torm came to stand beside me during a respite between attack waves. He was field repairing the secondary feed on his Stormbolter, his massive hands working with the automatic precision of a warrior who performs maintenance tasks without conscious attention because the conscious attention is occupied elsewhere. He said, without looking up from the weapon, "You are running the numbers." I said yes. He said, "What do the numbers say?" I told him. He was silent for a moment. Then, "The numbers have been wrong before." I said, "Not like this." Another silence. He finished the repair. He tested the feed mechanism. He said, "Brennick would say the Emperor provides." I said, "Brennick would be correct to say it. My question is whether what the Emperor provides is victory." Aldrich looked at me then. It was a long look, the look of a man taking a careful measurement, not of my tactical position but of something more interior. After a moment he said, quietly, "I have never heard you speak that sentence before. I have never been in a position to require it before." He looked at the space where Sevas had been. He looked at the walls, where the chitinous sound of movement never entirely ceased. Then he looked back at me and said, "There is a difference between what we are asked to accomplish and whether the Emperor desires we accomplish it alone." I considered that. He added, Herrn has been fighting things like this since before your gene seed was drawn. Ask him what they fear." I went to Brother Herrn. The ancient dreadnought was positioned at the corner junction of our defensive perimeter, oriented toward the longest of the approach corridors, utterly still in the way that only very old things can be still. Not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of a predator with infinite patience, who has learned that the game always comes to the patient eventually. I stood in front of him and asked the question directly. What do they fear? Herrn's response was not immediate. He processed in ways that are his own, filtered through mechanisms of cognition that the centuries of his diminished existence had reshaped beyond simple categorization. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of experiential memory that I felt more than heard. He said, "They do not fear death. Individual death means nothing to the brood. You might as well fear losing one hair from a head of thousands. They do not fear pain. Their neurological architecture does not process damage through the same reward/punishment framework that governs our biology or the biology of their prey. They do not fear being outnumbered, outgunned, or outmaneuvered. These are human fears, and they are not built for human fears." He paused. "They fear interruption. They fear the severing of the bond. They fear what lies outside the Patriarch's reach because outside the Patriarch's reach, they are diminished individual organisms rather than facets of a single mind. Whatever breaks that bond, whatever isolates individual creatures from the brood network, that is what they fear." I asked him, "And the Patriarch?" Another pause. Longer. "The Patriarch fears recognition. It fears being truly seen, not in the simple sense of detection, but in the deeper sense of being understood. Understood in its nature, its intelligence, its terrible loneliness. Loneliness, it is the only intelligence in the brood, the only one. Everything else is an extension of itself. It rules a kingdom of its own reflection. This has been its existence for thousands of years." I stood there in the cold and the noise and the smell of our dead, and I thought about that. "Loneliness," I said again. "Do not mistake it for weakness," Herrn said immediately. "It is the most dangerous thing in that structure, and it knows we are coming, and it has been waiting for something like us for a very long time. Perhaps not us specifically, but something that can see it. Something that can acknowledge what it is." "Why?" "Because it is the Emperor's creation," Herrn said. "In the broadest possible sense. It is a product of this galaxy, shaped by the same forces that shaped us, responding to the same underlying imperatives. It wants to be known. It wants its existence to be witnessed, even by something that has come to destroy it. I had no response to that. I stood in silence for a very long time. Then the next wave came and there was no more time for philosophy. On the third day we went deeper. Not because the mathematics of the situation had improved, they had not. Not because resupply had resolved the ammunition issue. It had not, though 3 torpedo pods carrying bolt rounds and medical supplies had been successfully fired from the bow and recovered from the Hulk's exterior, a logistical effort that had cost our fleet a great deal of careful maneuvering and 3 additional crew lives in the recovery operations. Not even because Marshal Cale had issued a new strategic directive, though he had, the revised plan calling for the 3 assault claws to consolidate into a single formation and push along the most direct route toward the Patriarch locus rather than the original multivector approach. We went deeper because there was no other direction that meant anything. That is the essential logic of the Eternal Crusade, and it is the logic that the Black Templars apply to every engagement regardless of scale. You do not retreat from the enemy of the Emperor. You do not consolidate and reassess and revise your strategic aims in light of adverse contact reports. You advance. The only acceptable direction is forward, and forward in that Hulk on that third day meant toward the center, toward whatever lived there, toward the thing that Hearn had described with a precision that refused to leave my thoughts. We consolidated with Marshal Cale's force at a broad chamber designated on our schematic as Node 19, originally, according to our cartographer's analysis, the main cargo hold of the Emperor-class battleship that formed the core of the Hulk's structure. The space was large enough to permit the kind of tactical formation that corridor fighting had denied us, and the Marshal had used the time before our arrival to establish a defensible perimeter using the cargo hold's original structural features, berths, bulk storage frames, load-bearing columns, as cover architecture. Cale was wounded. He had been wounded before I had been born into the chapter, and he carried those wounds the way a veteran carries all things. Not as evidence of damage, but as additional data points in the ongoing record of his existence. The wound from the previous day was to his left side, a deep laceration through a gap in the power armor ceramite where a Genestealer's rending claw had found purchase. Our apothecary, Brother Wren, had sealed the wound. Cale had not mentioned it since, which was either characteristic composure or characteristic stubbornness. With Cale, the two were not always distinguishable. The assembled force in Node 19 numbered 51 Adeptus Astartes. We had entered the Hulk with 106. I performed that calculation once and did not perform it again. Some calculations are most useful as single data points rather than recurring reference material. Cale gathered the senior sword brethren around the central display. A portable Auspex projector that cast the schematic of the Hulk in pale blue light across the faces of warriors who had been fighting for 3 days without adequate sleep, adequate nutrition, or adequate time to process the cost of what they had already endured. He spoke briefly. He always spoke briefly. The Marshal's talent for command resided not in the eloquence of his address but in its precision. He used exactly the words required and not one more, and every word carried the settled authority of a man who has never, in over a century of command, issued an order he was not fully prepared to enforce with his own body. He said, "We are at approximately 60% of the distance to the central bio-node. Our current rate of advance is insufficient to reach it before our supplies degrade below operational threshold. We will therefore change the nature of this operation." He paused to let that phrase settle. "We have been clearing corridors. We will stop clearing corridors. We will advance directly, along the most efficient route, and we will not stop to engage pursuit unless engagement is forced upon us. The objective is the Patriarch. Everything else in this structure is secondary." Aldrich Torm, speaking for the first time in the strategic conference, asked the question I had been holding. "What happens when we reach it? Our Auspex suggests the bio-node's location is a convergence point. Every organic signature in the structure is oriented toward it, not distributed from it. If we advance along the direct route, we will be drawing the entire infestation behind us." Cale looked at him. "Yes," he said. "We will have every creature in this structure between us and our breach points. Yes. There will be no extraction route. There will be no extraction route until the Patriarch is dead," Cale said. "Once the Patriarch is dead, the brood bond fractures. The creatures become individuals. Individuals can be managed. We manage them on the way out. He said this with the serene certainty of a man who has made a decision that acknowledges its own extremity and has not been altered by that acknowledgement. Reclusiarch Brennick spoke from behind his skull mask. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects, Kale confirmed. Move. We moved. The route to the central bionode passed through 11 sections of the Hulk that our schematic classified as structurally uncertain, meaning the cartographer's data could not guarantee the corridor integrity, and we were moving through spaces that might, at any moment, become something other than passable. It also passed through 3 sections with dense bioform readings that could not be bypassed, sections where the infestation had, over years or centuries, established something analogous to what I can only call habitation. Not dwelling, not in any sense that implies comfort or permanence beyond biological necessity, but aggregation, mass presence. A density of living bodies that filled the corridors not with ambush but simply with occupation. We drove through those sections with everything we had. Brother Hearn was our vanguard. The dreadnought in a confined space is a weapon of particular brutality. Not elegant, not subtle, the opposite of precise, but in corridors that had already been reduced to structural essentials by millennia of damage, where precision was not a factor and only force had meaning, Hearn was irreplaceable. He moved through resistance the way a geological force moves through softer material, implacable and apparently inexhaustible, and the sounds he made in those sections, the grinding of chassis against corridor wall, the hydraulic thunder of his combat arm, the occasional deep vocalization that was neither word nor entirely sound but occupied a register between the two, were the sounds of something very old and very angry finally given permission to express the full depth of what it was. I have never asked Hearn what those hours were like for him, inside the sarcophagus, fighting things he had fought before in a time so long ago that most of us could not reach it even with effort. I suspect the answer would be too complicated for language. We reached the approaches to the bionode at the end of the 3rd day. What lay beyond the last set of sealed blast doors was the original ship's reactor chamber, a space large enough that our helmet lamps could not reach all 4 walls simultaneously. And in that space, at the center of everything, was the Patriarch. I had studied the files. Every Adeptus Astartes officer of sufficient rank who might conceivably be deployed in a Tyranid-adjacent engagement is provided access to the Inquisition-compiled documentation on Genestealer Patriarchs, their biology, their behavioral patterns, their tactical role within the brood hierarchy, their physical capabilities. I had read the files. I had viewed the pict captures, the cold, institutional photographs taken by inquisitorial documentation teams after successful purges, showing the Patriarch's remains with the dispassionate thoroughness of a forensic record. The files do not prepare you. The files describe a large organism. What sat at the center of that reactor chamber was not, in any experiential sense, merely a large organism. It was the center of something. It was the presence that every creature in the Hulk existed in relationship to, the point toward which the entire biological ecosystem of the formation oriented itself the way a field of iron filings orients to a magnet. It was not simply physically massive, though it was, its body a thing of accumulated centuries, grotesque in its dimensions, a physical record of every generation of growth and every decade of dormant metabolic conservation applied to a biology already built for extremity. Beyond the physical, it occupied space differently. It was present in the room in excess of its body, as if the Patriarch's consciousness projected into the surrounding space, filling it, claiming it, making the very air around it contiguous with its awareness. Its eyes were on me from the moment the blast doors opened. Not on Kale. Not on Hearn. On me. I have no explanation for this. I have offered many attempted explanations to myself over the years since, and none of them is fully satisfactory. The simplest, and perhaps truest, is that it recognized something in me that it wished to engage with. Not as predator recognizes prey. As something recognizes something. I remembered what Hearn had said. It fears recognition. It wants to be seen. The blast doors had not fully separated before the creatures in the chamber began to move. A surging mass of brood spawn, hundreds of forms, the walls alive with them, the floor thick with them, responding to the intrusion with the same collective impulse that had characterized every wave we had fought through for 3 days. Kale issued the command to advance, and we advanced, 51 Adeptus Astartes into the convergence of an infestation that had been building in this space for longer than most chapters of the Space Marines had existed. Hearn went through them like a breaking tide. The noise was extraordinary, the sustained thunder of bolt weapons in an enclosed space capable of reverberating that thunder back at us from multiple angles simultaneously, the shrieking biological percussion of hundreds of organisms responding to trauma and death, and the disruption of the brood bond as we killed them in numbers sufficient to degrade the network's coherence. Brennick was preaching constantly now, his voice a sustained incantation over the Vox. The words of the Eternal Crusade's deepest rites filling the acoustic space alongside the weapon's fire. I moved through it. I moved toward the center. I do not know exactly how I moved through the press of bodies. I have no complete sequential memory of those minutes, which is not unusual in combat of that intensity, where the cognitive load of moment-to-moment survival suppresses the formation of detailed linear memory and leaves instead a collection of vivid fragments. I remember Aldrich at my shoulder, never more than a meter away, the storm bolter exhausted and his chainsword running instead. I remember a Genestealer reaching for my helmet and my power fist crushing its thorax before the grip could establish. I remember stumbling over something and not looking down because I knew what it was. I remember arriving at the center. The Patriarch was still. In the middle of everything. In the chaos of its own brood dying around it. In the noise and the light and the killing. It was completely still. It sat in a configuration that my mind kept misinterpreting as a throne, though there was no throne, only the fused wreckage of the reactor housing raised into an accidental dais by the geological pressures of decades of warp transit. It was watching me. It had been watching me since the doors opened. I stood in front of it. My squad was at my flanks. The fighting continued behind me. It would continue behind me for another 12 minutes before the Patriarch's death began to fracture the brood bond sufficiently to degrade the collective response. I did not look behind me. I looked at the Patriarch. And I will confess to you, I will confess this because this record is supposed to be true, and a true record requires the accounting of things that reflect poorly on one's certainties. What I felt in that moment was not rage. Not zealotry. Not the clean, propulsive power of faith directed toward its object. I felt something approaching grief. Not for it. I want to be absolutely clear on that point. Not for the Patriarch. Not for the brood. Not for whatever had happened to this organism over its 4,000 years of darkness. I felt grief for the fact that this was what we had come to, that at the center of this ancient and terrible thing, at the end of 3 days of fighting and dying and questioning, what I found was an intelligence that had been alone for longer than my chapter had existed, that had filled its solitude with the only material available to it, that had built from that material something as close to a world as it was capable of constructing, and that world was a nightmare. And I had come to end it, not because it was evil in any theological sense, because the galaxy could not afford it, because the tyrannid shadow that would eventually arrive for what the Patriarch had seeded here would be worse than anything the Patriarch itself had done or could do. Because that is the calculus of the Imperium, and I serve the Imperium, and the Imperium's calculus is correct. I brought my power fist forward. The Patriarch did not move to defend itself. It opened its mouth, and I do not know what that gesture was. Whether it was aggression or surrender or something else entirely, something that exists in a behavioral vocabulary I do not have the framework to read, and the sound it produced was not the hiss or the shriek of the creatures we had been fighting. It was a sound with depth to it, with interior complexity, with the quality of something meant to communicate rather than merely threaten. I drove the power fist into its skull with every erg of force the armor could generate. The brood bond shattered. The noise of the chamber changed instantly, the collective coherence of the swarm fragmented into individual responses, disoriented, individually purposeless without the coordinating intelligence that had given their aggression direction and their patience meaning. They continued to fight because they are built to fight, but they fought without coordination, without the terrifying distributed intelligence that had made them nearly unmanageable for 3 days, and that difference was the difference between an impossible enemy and merely a very dangerous one. We killed what remained. We set the charges 2 hours after the Patriarch fell. Not melta charges, we had used most of those. The final destruction of the Hulk required a different order of force, and Marshal Kale had planned for this from the beginning in a way that I had not fully appreciated until it was explained to me in the extraction chamber. 4 of the boarding torpedoes had carried, in addition to their human cargo, sealed demolition packages assembled by the Mechanicum adepts, thermic charges of sufficient yield to ignite the Hulk's residual fuel stores, which the Auspex had been mapping throughout our advance and which, if properly initiated, would produce a cascading combustion event through the entire formation sufficient to sterilize it. Not destroy it. Not initially. The Hulk was too massive for any ordnance we could deploy to produce total destruction. But sterilize, to kill everything biological within its structure that had survived our advance, to ensure that no dormant egg sacs remained viable, no insisted brood form waited in stasis pockets within the hull material, no fragment of genestealer genetics survived in any environment within the formation capable of sustaining biological development. A space Hulk that has been boarded and purged but not fully sterilized is more dangerous than one that has never been touched. The disruption of a brood creates conditions favorable to the dispersal of surviving organisms, fragments of the infestation departing the formation through hull breaches, floating in the void on biological buoyancy systems evolved for exactly this purpose, eventually making contact with another vessel or planetoid, carrying the seed of a new infestation to a new location. We had come to purge, not to scatter. The charges were set. The extraction was made through the reserve breach point Kale had designated on the first day. The fourth option, the one held in reserve, the decision that had been right in ways that could not have been fully foreseen at the time it was made. 23 Adeptus Astartes emerged from that breach point. Of the 5 who had been listed as missing contact throughout the operation, 2 squads from Assault Claw Gamma and the individual members who had been reported lost in the first 24 hours, we recovered 3. 2 in fragments, which is the apothecary's responsibility to address and the record-keeper's responsibility to catalog and no one else's to dwell on. 1 alive, in a state that our apothecary described with careful precision as recoverable, and by which he meant something that sounded better than its realistic content. 23. The charges detonated 17 minutes after the last warrior cleared the breach point. I watched from the observation deck of the Blade of the Unbroken Vow as the Hulk's interior lit up, sequentially, in the staggered progression of the cascading ignition sequence, each fuel store catching from the one before it, the light visible through the hull breaches as a glow that began deep within the formation and expanded outward, taking minutes to reach the surface as it consumed everything in its path. It was beautiful in the way that destruction on a sufficient scale is always beautiful. Not because the destruction is good, but because it is absolute, because it is the universe enacting a conclusion with the unsentimental thoroughness that physical process does not permit to be anything other than complete. The hull vented fire in long, sweeping exhalations. The biological signatures on the Auspex dropped below detection threshold over the course of 4 minutes. Then they were gone. I stood at the observation viewport and watched until there was nothing left to watch, until the fires had exhausted the available fuel and gone dark, and the Hulk sat in the light of the dying red star as it had sat before we arrived. Enormous, ancient, indifferent. Still carrying its dead. Still wearing the silhouette of 12 distinct starship classes. Still bearing the specific wound geometry of a structure shaped by forces too vast and too old to be expressed in tactical vocabulary. Still, in some sense I cannot fully articulate, present. Hearn stood behind me. I had not heard him approach. A dreadnought is not built for silence. But Hearn had learned, over his centuries, to move with a deliberateness that consumed the noise of his own motion. He stood behind me and we looked at the Hulk together for a time without speaking. Then he said, "You killed it cleanly." I said yes. He said, "But you felt something." I said yes. He did not ask what I had felt. He said, "After the 4th century you stop being surprised by the things you feel in places like that. But you don't stop feeling them. I used to think that was a weakness. I understand now that it is not." I asked him what it was. "The record," he said. "The only record those things get. The only acknowledgement. You went in there knowing what you would do, and you did it, and between going in and doing it you spent 3 days in there with them, and you saw enough to understand something of what they were, and that understanding is the only monument they will ever receive. That matters. Not for them. For you. For what you carry out when you leave." I thought about that for a long time. The Hulk would drift. With the infestation gone, the formation no longer represented an immediate threat, though our fleet would maintain observation until our Mechanicum adepts were satisfied that no secondary biological contamination risk remained. Eventually, the Vow and the Iron Adherent and the other vessels of the Third Crusade fleet would break station and resume the Eternal Crusade, carrying its objectives forward into the next engagement, the next war zone, the next iteration of the same fundamental task. We had lost 83 warriors. Brothers whose gene seed our apothecary had recovered where recovery was possible, brothers whose gene seed was gone with the fires, brothers whose names would be added to the rolls of honor that every Black Templar Crusade fleet maintains with the meticulous devotion of a people who know that individual warriors are finite resources and the crusade is an infinite commitment. Their names are there, if you know where to look, and if you have access to the records of the Third Crusade of the Vain Blade, you can read them. Seves. And the others. All 83. Each one a century of investment or close to it. Each one a piece of something that cannot be replaced, that can only be mourned and then continued without. Marshal Cale survived. He is, as of the time of this record, still on active campaign, leading a subsequent crusade in a subsector I am not authorized to name. His wound healed. His orders are still brief. His certainty is still intact, or it presents as intact, which in a commander of his tenure and responsibility is perhaps the same thing. Reclusiarch Brennick survived. He preached at the memorial service for the 83 with the same granite composure he brought to every service. Not coldness, but the warmth of a man who has learned to hold grief inside the architecture of belief and carry it rather than be consumed by it. He said things that were true. He said things that were useful. He said things that I will not repeat here because they belong to that service and not to this record. Aldrich Torm survived. He is at my side now as I dictate this. He is performing maintenance on a chainsword. He has not looked up from the maintenance work throughout the entire dictation. That is either because the work requires all his attention, or because some records are easier to exist in proximity to when you are looking at something comprehensible. I survived. I carry the record of the Hulk in the way that Hearn said, not as trauma, not as damage, though it is both of those things as well. As understanding. As a monument to something that was, in its specific horror, also something. Presence. An intelligence that had built from darkness and hunger the closest approximation of a world it could manage. That built it badly, that built it into something the galaxy could not permit to continue. But that built it. There is a question at the center of what I experienced in that structure that I have not resolved in the years since. Whether the things we destroy in the Emperor's name, the heretics, the Xenos, the devotees of the ruinous powers, whether they constitute a legitimate moral weight that belongs in the accounting alongside the legitimate necessity of their destruction. Whether the Black Templar manner of faith, the faith that advances, that does not stop to reckon, that treats forward momentum as the proof of righteousness, is fully adequate to what this galaxy actually is. I have not resolved this question. I do not think resolution is available to me. I think the question is the kind that a warrior carries for the rest of his service, in the space between one engagement and the next, in the quiet moments when there is no enemy in front of him and no command requiring his immediate response. In those moments, I stand at a viewport if one is available, and I look at the dark. I think about what lives in it. I think about what it takes to go in, and I think about what it means to come back out. The crusade continues. It always continues. For the Emperor. In his name. Without end.